South of the capital of Djibouti, military compounds, outposts, airfields, docks, and all sorts of military facilities dot the landscape. They belong separately to France, Japan, Italy, and the United States, with Spanish and German forces being stationed in the French base. Some 10 kilometers to the north is an imposing Chinese compound with sophisticated surveillance equipment. It is in Djibouti where so many militaries are closer to one another than anywhere else. So, what's going on? And how did Djibouti emerge as a conduit for strategic real estate? I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Before we continue, special thanks to today's sponsor, Throne, Kingdom at War. If you enjoy the lore of Game of Thrones and the gaming mechanics of Diablo or Final Fantasy, you'll feel right at home here. Throne is a free-to-play web browser game with millions of players. You don't need to download or install anything, just go to the link in the description, build up your castles and towns, call on your bannermen, and claim what is rightfully yours. It will help out our channel. Now back to Djibouti. Shortly after gaining independence from France in 1977, Djibouti went through a violent phase where it grappled with ethnic tensions, economic volatility, and political insecurity. Today, however, the country is considered a rare beacon of stability. At the price of political freedom, the government has kept the peace, while the national GDP per capita steadily climbed to $3,700, compared to neighboring Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, which sit at $800, $700, and $600 respectively. Djibouti is doing remarkably well. The secret to its success lies in its territory, not the land itself though. Djibouti has no meaningful natural resources to speak of. The climate is hot to arid, with the land being mostly dry. Just 2 generations ago, most of its residents lived as nomads. Yet, in spite of its size, policymakers in Djibouti have ambitious plans. For years, the government has sought to transform the country to the likes of Dubai and Singapore. That's a high bar, and to attain this objective, the Djiboutian leadership has been willing to take geopolitical risks. At a little over 23,000 square kilometers and with less than 1 million citizens, Djibouti is valued for its geostrategic position, bordered by Ethiopia in the west, Somalia to the east, and Eritrea to the north. Djibouti's eastern coastline hugs the Red Sea, thereby connecting the markets of the Mediterranean Sea with the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. In other words, Djibouti port overlooks some of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Nearly 25% of the globe's exports pass through its waters, including 4.8 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products on a daily basis. Complicating matters is the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, a 32-kilometer wide passage between Djibouti and Yemen. Unlike the Suez Canal in the north, where the Egyptians have worked tirelessly to stabilize and enhance the logistics, the Bab el-Mandeb choke point is surrounded by clusters of weak states such as Yemen, Eritrea, and by extension of Somaliland, Somalia itself. As such, the odds of a severe disruption in global trade is highest in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The nearby states are so caught up in their domestic struggles that they are in no position to secure their territorial waters, let alone the adjacent international maritime passages. This lack of naval focus is one of the critical factors that contributed to the rise of piracy on the Somali coast. For the global community, which relies on the freedom of navigation, the lack of internal and external stability in the Horn of Africa has been a persistent source of concern. The urgent need for stability is what propelled the government of Djibouti to rent its strategic real estate to foreign militaries looking up to set bases. Without any other form of income, territory was used as a means of generating capital. Since then, most of the maritime traffic that passes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait goes by the Western Stream, bypassing Parim Island, which belongs to Yemen and sits by the southern entrance of the Red Sea. As international shipping favors traveling through Djibouti's territorial waters, the effective navigable width of the Bab el-Mandab choke point is further narrowed down to 20 kilometers, calculated from Djibouti's coast to Yemen's Perim Island. Again, all this works in favor of Djibouti. French troops numbering around 1,500 personnel remained in Djibouti after the country gained independence. In the past 2 decades, however, Djibouti moved its interests beyond France. After the 9/11 attacks, the Pentagon leased a former French compound where it currently houses about 6,000 soldiers, accompanied by a host of fighter planes, bombers, drones, and helicopters. In 2013, Italy joined the banquet and set up a base with 300 personnel, and shortly thereafter, Spanish and German forces embedded themselves to the French base. But it's not just NATO that runs the show, as more global powers realized that Djibouti was ideally suited for peacekeeping missions and combating piracy off the coasts of Yemen and Somalia. Asian countries signed up as well. In 2011, Japan constructed a base for its 600 military personnel and recently expressed plans to expand the local docks and runways. Even Saudi Arabia is in negotiations to open its own military facility in Djibouti, and Ethiopia has acquired a significant stake in a commercial Djiboutian port as well. Overshadowing the competition is China's massive military fortress, which has 3 underground floors and can accommodate up to 10,000 soldiers. At a staggering cost of $590 million, it is Beijing's first overseas military base outside Asia. Djibouti also hosts naval vessels from numerous countries in its commercial ports, providing fresh supplies, maintenance, and recreational needs. All this turns the country into a geopolitical laboratory where Europe, Africa, and Asia converge and interact. It is therefore no coincidence that Djibouti hosts more foreign military bases than any other country in the globe. Altogether, these foreign militaries generate more than $300 million in annual income for the Djiboutian government. For a small African state, that is a handsome amount. Even if the political leadership changed, the practice of renting real estate to foreign militaries would remain the same. It has become the pillar of Djibouti's geo-economic policy. Beyond real estate, Djibouti also acts as the sole maritime entry point for neighboring Ethiopia. The landlocked African giant, with a population of 102 million and a booming economy, ships up to 95% of its trade through the ports of Djibouti. Cross-border trade between Ethiopia and Djibouti is so profound that up until the inauguration of the new Addis Ababa-Djibouti railway in 2018, port and rail capacity had reached its limit. Looking ahead at the future, by 2050, Ethiopia's population is expected to eclipse 188 million people and continue to climb at an accelerating speed. As Ethiopians increase in numbers and their purchasing power grows along with it, Djibouti stands to hitchhike on the ascent of Addis Ababa, since it's likely to remain the primary entry point to the country in the coming decades. Another international partner that stands out is China. While most foreign governments have strictly focused on counter-piracy and counter-terrorism activities, Beijing has invested in ports, railways, banks, industrial parks, etc. In the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, China needs access to strategic physical assets and natural resources across the globe. Whether it's oil deposits, pipelines, or ports, such infrastructure assets are necessary to ensure that Chinese exports can reach consumer markets without interruptions. The more physical assets Beijing has, the more secure its resupply and logistic points become. For China, Djibouti marks a critical point in the supply chain of the Belt and Road, which explains the presence of the Chinese military. As impressive as the geoeconomics of Djibouti sound, the policy is not without its deficiencies. Foremost, the growing economic power of the state has not benefited ordinary people in any meaningful way. Despite years of high GDP growth, poverty rates stand at 79%, with 42% of the population living in extreme poverty. Economic growth has mostly resulted in political confidence, allowing the government to become more repressive than it was in the past. Secondly, much of the GDP growth has come with Chinese credit. For instance, in recent years, Beijing extended a $250 million loan for Djibouti's new free trade zone. It then provided another $500 million for a new railway and another $400 million for a new container port. That's a lot of money for a small African state, and it goes without saying that some of these projects come with predatory loans, where credit is offered with little to no interest early on, followed by high interest for many years. For comparison, Djibouti's current public debt totals 104% of its GDP. Most of it is owed to Beijing. However, for the leaders of Djibouti, overseeing a small country with no resources, Chinese credit is crucial for preventing social unrest. Without credit, the subsequent instability would undermine everything the state worked for in the past 2 decades. Thus, aware of the debt trap, Djiboutian policymakers don't have much choice in the matter. The third deficiency in the geo-economic policy of Djibouti is that its advances have inspired other countries to act as well, especially the nations of the Arabian Peninsula. In June 2017, Qatar withdrew its peacekeeping contingent from the disputed frontier between Djibouti and Eritrea, allowing Eritrean forces to occupy the disputed area. At the same time, Saudi lawmakers started negotiating to establish a military footprint of their own in Djibouti to combat Houthi rebels in Yemen. Still in 2017, lawmakers in Somaliland, which considers itself independent from the rest of Somalia, agreed to allow the United Arab Emirates to set up a naval base at the port of Berbera and upgrade the local port facilities. Emirati policymakers have also set up bases in Eritrea, while Turkey is working on sophisticated naval ports in Somalia and Sudan. Even Iran is on it, with its officials trying to coerce the government of Sudan in its favor. All this activity illustrates that the Horn of Africa is amid considerable geopolitical strife where global and regional powers seek to expand their holdings. Djibouti is perhaps the single most strategic state in the periphery. It has the potential to develop as the gateway for landlocked African countries and serve as a major shipping center connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. But the state must walk a fine line as competition for ports will intensify in the coming years. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Special thanks to our Patreon contributors for making content like this possible, and if you want to learn more about our crowdfunding, visit the links in the description. For now, take care and Sarol.